Okay, Christine, I was just wondering how and why you got interested in shopping contexts. And what is it specifically about those environments that really appeal to you?
Um, if I try to think back now about opening my shop, the Volksboutique, in 1996, it's sort of ironic that that was coming off. I mean, I would say between my arrival in Berlin in '91 and opening the shop. I mean, I was the least consumer-minded person, both for financial reasons and just that I just felt like my life in Berlin, it wasn't at all. I mean, I was also living in East Berlin where there was not this kind of consumer craziness that I know from the States or something. But at the same time, I one of my kind of fun, kind of seminal experiences living in Berlin was that a lot of East German shops were sort of counter only, so you could only get what you wanted by being in dialogue with the person behind the counter. Okay. And that for me in the beginning was a language problem, but then it was also sort of a negotiation situation. And so I think I was more interested. Prior to opening the shop, I had been doing a lot of performative work where what I was simply trying to set up conversations with whoever I was encountering in exhibitions or performance kind of presentations. So the shop was the idea it was more the interest in creating a space where that kind of exchange would happen, and then the interest in kind of a prolonged investigation of what shopkeeping is kind of came after that. So I would almost say that the Volksboutique, having been a shop, was sort of an accident, and then it birthed all of this subsequent kind of interest. But a lot of the projects that Volksboutique has done have not been shops per se. They've been sort of service venues that always have a transactional moment that is either over the counter or over a desk, and like I said, in my mind, that becomes a kind of expanded form of shopkeeping, even though there isn't, there is usually an economic component, not always. There's usually a service element, but not always, and there is usually this breaking down of, or there's this introduction of a very quotidian, familiar daily space that people recognize from their rounds, whether it's going in a shop or going in an office. And I try to kind of pull those back into my projects so that people are they're intrigued or almost sometimes irritated by the fact that they think, well, this doesn't look like art, this looks like a shop, or this looks like a business. And I would definitely say the interest is larger and is of course in kind of keeping the shop shipshape, but also the kind of, entire business element.
And did you experience those dialogues that you were after then, if that was your interest initially?
Certainly. I was, the initial Volksboutique had two incarnations, the shop in Berlin, and then during Documenta 10 in 97, what I was calling the franchise in Kassel, where Documenta is held. And also the sheer scale shift at being in an exhibition like the Documenta meant, thousands and thousands and thousands of people were, kind of swarming by that project, whereas in Berlin it was much, much more kind of, within normal day-to-day business of, maybe 20 people coming by. I was very intent on, everyone knows from going into a shop, there's always some sort of initial kind of conversational foray made by the shopkeeper, which is let me know if there's anything you need, or have you found everything you're looking for. Let me either suggestions for help, which today I think kind of veer off into them being a little bit much more aggressive by like kind of jumping on you. And I personally would just like to see how people would respond if I would say, and a question like, do you have everything you're looking for is an open question. I mean, it doesn't necessarily need to have anything to do with, is the t-shirt selection here satisfactory? And so I found that the shop, became, I was having studied so much work about kind of, anything kind of coming off of the ideas of social sculpture. I was very interested in creating a kind of inclusive environment that looked like a shop, functioned like a shop, and let people kind of relax in it. But then what kind of conversations happened in there didn't by any means exclusively have to deal with the shop of business. There was a lot of discussion about weather, a lot of people hanging out longer than necessary, to actually purchase anything. I think in the beginning there were some sort of like art curious type of people who would either be like, okay, we heard this is an art project, let's go see if it is. But that actually became, much less the case. And I think it was much more people who were kind of just interested to see what was happening and who might be there. At Documenta, obviously, there were the conversations became much more. There was much more space for kind of critical dialogue about, things like what are you doing with the money and why are you allowed to do something that sells things in what is not quote unquote a commercial exhibition. Me, talking about like, well, is this a commercial exhibition? A lot of that had to do with people either feeling like, yes, all art should be free, or we already paid an entrance fee, so this should be free. I mean, it was, I wasn't charging a fee to enter. It was just if you wanted to buy something. And even it was interesting for me about kind of stereotypical expectations of art, that the things I was selling were being sold at a price that I felt was acceptable for them. They weren't free. I wasn't doing something strange like shredding them and putting them in a box and therefore producing an art object. And I wasn't selling them for $4,000, elevating them to some sort of art collector price. And it was interesting to discuss that with people and to see, what their expectations were, and just in general have a conversation about that.
Mm-hmm. And I'm just wondering then how you actually went about pricing those pieces individually, obviously to always make a profit in terms of perceived value or,
Well, one thing that was possible for Volksboutique in 1996 in Berlin was things like both shops. The Berlin shop had such low overhead, and thankfully the exhibition also, that the overhead was not my responsibility. With the Berlin store as a model, my idea from the get-go was, okay, if the overhead is just low and you're willing to sock a ton of personal energy into it, almost any sale price is coming in at a profit. So, you just want to try to get all that stuff coordinated as best as you can. Almost all of the clothing for the Volksboutique was by donation. Almost everything in the Volksboutique was donation. And I mean, prior, the 5 years I'd lived in Berlin prior, Berlin Mitte in the early 90s was kind of scavenger central. I mean, everyone was kind of just wandering around with a wagon or, their truck picking up cast-offs, and the city was full of them. A lot of East German residents just tossed everything they owned and kind of upgraded to Western products. It was such a different financial climate than one would expect for a major city. And the Volksboutique was about sort of memorializing that time. And practically, I was soliciting clothing by donation, soliciting hangers from department stores by just being, brazen enough to go to them and ask for them. The mirror, there was a huge, kind of ballerina's mirror in the room on the wall so that people could see themselves and see the whole room reflected. That was also donated. So it was, more the kind of ad hoc, long-term assembly of all of this stuff that then meant once everything was in there, basically anything I sell is at a profit. And at Documenta, the difference is, what I said, was a kind of a volume difference as well. So, I mean, there wasn't any need to price things differently. It was just that there was so many more people coming in. And a lot of people, I was actually quite intrigued that the people who were donating clothes knew what was happening and were so kind of thrilled to be involved that it never occurred to them to say, well, wait a minute, we know the consignment shop as a business form, and we also know, the Red Cross as a place to donate, but this was neither. Mm-hmm. And I kind of, I wasn't sure if they were sort of trying to personally support me or thought the artification of their clothing, might be an interesting thing to be a part of. I give them the option, obviously, to be kind of financially involved if they felt they needed something. So, and the Castle store as well, I was having nightmares before that show opened about the vast numbers of visitors and thinking, oh my God, if the place is picked clean in a week and I've got a whole summer, to figure out, and that was never a problem, and it was interesting for me as well to see, are people buying these clothes just so that they can say, I got a 20 mark artwork? Or are they going to use them? And it would have certainly been more preferable to me that they would wear them, even if some people did clearly pick things for their ugliness rather than their, flattering aspects. It would have been disappointing for me to have, them take the whole thing with the sticker, the label, the bag, and the hanger and hang it up somewhere and say, like, that is a product of the Volksboutique. That wasn't really what I was hoping for.
Okay. I'm just imagining if it was on eBay right now, could we kind of tell? But and then I was wondering what it is that you particularly enjoy about kind of describe in order kind of process and this accounting for time, because obviously the time seems as important as materiality.
Well, I think. It's sort of, it's a long-term problem or preoccupation of mine is what is the job of an artist? What do people think the job of the artist is? There is some sort of, I'm from an industrial kind of town that had like one major industry, IBM. So there's some sort of kind of thing about productivity ingrained in me, and some sort of kind of earning an honest dollar thing that we know that kind of got drilled into me. And of course, when I decided to study art, there was this sort of collective throwing up of hands about like, oh my God, she could have been a doctor, she could have been a lawyer, and now she's throwing it all away to do this frivolous thing. And I guess part of me is, preoccupied with the potential use value of art and what it can elicit from people. A lot of it is just, as a child, I was 17 before I actually saw a bona fide art exhibition. Mm-hmm. So up until that time, what I had seen was a lot of, just, the spaces I was used to being in, and I didn't by any means go into an art exhibition and have a revelatory moment thinking, oh, this is where I belong. So I'm as an artist way more at home in other artists' workspaces than in their exhibitions, and I always am trying to kind of transport that into everything I do. So when I'm in a normal anybody's shop, I like to see, how do they have all of their internal correspondence ordered? What are they using as a mat to put the credit card receipt on so that the pen doesn't bleed through? What sort of little innovations or personalizations have they made to the space to to kind of, I like I've never really worked in a kind of cubicle office, but the whole personalization of the office cubicle is fascinating to me, or when it's not allowed, and how anybody could get anything done there. So I think I can't even remember what the original question was.
What is it that you enjoy?
Yeah, I mean, I enjoy the sort of how that kind of space gets personalized, and at the same time also retains its utilitarian nature. That's like that's an ingrained family trait. My entire family is like that, and those are the environments that I feel more aligned with than some sort of pristine or some sort of incredibly reduced environment.
Mm-hmm. And I'm wondering, could you describe in detail kind of the decisions that you make when you're building an environment, mm-hmm. whether it's a shop or, as you said, to take other forms, and really how do you kind of go about identifying the register, mm-hmm. Kind of scale or the look of it, and actually leading on to that, really the kind of the degree of reality or fiction, and I'm thinking even facade and veneer, words that we associate also with shops generally. So how you kind of achieve that.
I think initially I was very into sort of taking pre-existing materials and just kind of rearranging them to make an environment that looked familiar. Whereas we had discussed a little bit earlier a project like Home Office, which was built. Yeah, I mean these were a lot of elements that I conceived of and manufactured. And I think that in the beginning, it was very kind of indicative of working in the 90s that, there seemed to be so much stuff anyway that, you could just kind of have a field day just kind of working with things. And the Volksboutique originally, I had relocated to East Germany, so I was kind of being steeped in a completely new visual environment, and the way the GDR shops, businesses, very bureaucratic culture. It's very storied at this point, the degree to which the place was sort of overly bureaucratic and how things ran and bureaucratic and just very kind of slow and plodding the way progress was. So those kind of environments crept into the work, although there isn't exclusively a decade or something that I'm kind of fixated on. That a lot of it, I think, also having exhibited a lot in the 90s, people would need chairs and tables, and suddenly just all this random stuff would appear from the museum basement or something, and I felt much more interested in visually deciding what these things were going to be, and not just saying, well, any tables, any chairs, any this, any that, it's fine, and as long as someone can sit and someone can work. So I got very kind of overly interested in the kind of provenance of some of the materials that I was working in. And for example, a project like Home Office from 2002 and 2003, a lot of the materials from that project stem from the liquidation of a stationer in Lower Manhattan who was a friend of mine, a gentleman named Gene Frank, who had run this business for 25 years and decided to go into retirement. And so he sort of bequeathed me his entire remaining inventory, including the desk that he'd done business at for 25 years, and his cash register, and his vitrines, and a lot of his paper products. And so those things sort of got revived in exhibitions that I did subsequently that just took the kind of history of those objects and put them in another working environment. The second kind of Volksboutique space that I made following the shop was a tour guide agency in Lower Manhattan. In 1999, it was in an art gallery, Deutsche Projects, and that was sort of I sort of felt like making the shop. I don't think it required as much consideration. It seemed very clear what I needed to do, but with making the tour guide agency less so. Not a lot of tour guide agencies in New York have even an office. So, and whether or not that environment was going to be a successful one wasn't immediately clear. Literally the day I opened it and had the door open and the blinds up, a couple came in. The project tour guide was running the kind of like city tours of an area of Lower Manhattan, walking tours, and the environment, looked like an office. But the first day I opened, 2 people came in, sat down, and said, "We need 2 tickets to Denver," and somehow I felt like, okay, well, this is obviously working somewhere in the direction I needed to work in. Mm-hmm. I think initially with like I said, sometimes it's odd for me to speak a lot about Volksboutique in '96 because, I was a lot younger. It was one of the first pieces I did. Obviously, it sort of started this whole thing, but it's interesting for me to now think about what my criteria and what I felt was a necessity was then, and what sort of developed out of that. I would say the Volksboutique was very sort of like, the shop was somewhat a kind of like, it was a very familiar thing in Berlin at that time, and I would definitely say people were sort of surprised that it was being considered an art project because it didn't differentiate itself that much from other shops of that nature. Probably a little bit more sort of improvised than some shops might have been, but I think there were certain elements of artsiness that people were looking for that they weren't finding, either some sort of convoluted manner of conducting business or some sort of theatrical manner of doing it, or, I don't know, video screen, some element that people recognize from art exhibition that they didn't find in that. So I would say yes. And in that point, the idea was, to do something that was what it was claiming to be. I think ensuing projects, depending on what they've been, and again, home office or the accounting archive in Liverpool as well, those aren't necessarily things that people go, well, I know exactly what this is. It started becoming environments that looked like they were authored by Volksboutique. My sister calls them Volksboutique world. And so I still am careful that things are not overly theatrical. The conceit of home office probably was the most, in that the idea was that I would do a number of tasks in this created office. And I did not, my very, very first solo exhibition in a gallery was in my Berlin gallery in 1995. And I basically just moved my entire studio into the gallery and worked there as if I was at home. And with the exception that people were coming in and I was talking to them. There was other than the fact that the 4 walls around it changed, there was no difference. A project like Home Office, done many years later, was not at all like moving my private workspace into there. It was a very sort of stylized workspace, and it was it was coming out of a different era. But it was certainly still in all, there were people coming in saying, well, I'm in an art exhibition. Why? I don't want to talk about work. I want to, be absolved of work. And then, and for me, it's more that, I don't see art as some sort of respite from reality, I don't, I'm not looking for. I'd rather be working on altering the reality than just trying to escape it in terms of entertainment or culture or art. So. But at the same time, of course, I think at this point it's hard to know, what part of that is sort of my own personal predilection. People enter my home and sort of remark that it doesn't look like most people's homes. I mean, there are a lot of collections. Everything is very, very, very kind of carefully arranged. It's not by any means sort of, I think I kind of approach most things as a sort of environment. And there's a really great term that I learned from the artist Morgan Pewitt, which I guess comes out of the South, and it comes out of the styling industry, which is called hooshing, which is sort of, I guess that probably has some sort of German background to it, but it's sort of the term for, every physical thing has some sort of consideration. Like, you don't leave the bedroom without everything sort of, even if it's a mess, it's a kind of well-conceived mess. Mm-hmm. And I think, the way I approach environments now kind of became, sort of developed a sort of distinctive style that is less exactly real, like maybe the earlier projects were. And they're not works like, think of like the installation artist Guillaume Biel, who really is trying to one-to-one, like, simulate something that we know and put it in and just move where it is. And for me, I think it's just kind of borrowing a lot of devices that happen in business and office culture, but sort of mixing them up depending on what I feel is kind of appropriate for the space.
Mm-hmm. And you've mentioned style there several times. And I made the comment to you in the email, I have the sense of, and I am judging some of this on imagery, but I have the sense of that kind of corporate American optimism in it. Obviously some of the kind of typography that's used, the posters, the quotes, and yet I don't really have a sense that it's done in an ironic way. But I mean, has the 50s, or is there a particular period even that actually is very influential in terms of the look that you feel at home with, or that?
Well, I think, as I said, like I went to school at the end of the 80s and the beginning of the 90s, and so both the art world, what little I knew about it, and the city that I was in, it was sort of like graffiti culture, and so that was very, very kind of, there was this like Jeff Koons' heyday at that time, or Jean-Michel Basquiat's heyday, and so that was very interesting to me, and I was very interested in sort of hip-hop culture. Then when I moved, kind of made this massive shift from living in the East Coast in America to living in East Berlin, sort of leftovers. That became very fascinating to me. It's certainly a lot of the way the Volkseigenem Betrieb, which is like the people's enterprise in East Germany, which is the terminology that Volksboutique takes its name from. Volkseigenem Betrieb was sort of the production center for everything in East Germany, and like Dixie cups and mustard and bedding and stationery, everything was produced by this industry. So obviously being surrounded by that was very influential to me. In general, as I kind of collected more, I spent a lot of time just looking at environments to see, how they'll kind of resonate with me. There's a film, I'm going to guess this film is from 1957, and it's by Elia Kazan. It's called A Face in the Crowd, and it stars a very popular American actor, Andy Griffith, at the beginning of his career, and it's about kind of the beginning of television and how a sort of down-homey country guy gets corrupted by media. And of course the film is in the 50s, so a lot of the style of the film, the offices, the desks, but particularly that film has a lot of sort of advertising lingo and a lot of like kind of funny presentations where like a woman in like a tutu comes out and like presents something on a cardboard, presentation thing, and that whole film sort of really speaks to me in a very specific way. A lot of the postering that happens in my projects is actual grocery store signage postering. I work with a poster painter in Staten Island who I'm quite sure I'm her only artistic client, and that people recognize that kind of lingo. I living in Germany for so long, it's not, I'm back, I get asked a lot about how much of this is Americanized, how much of it is German. There's, or influenced by Germany. Of course, a lot of it is this sort of, I can't even think what it is. Like in German, there's a phrase "from Tellerwäscher zu Millionär," which basically means from dishwasher to millionaire. This sort of like anything goes, American dream thing. But and also the way I grew up. I mean, I remember very distinctly visiting my father's office as a child. He worked for IBM, and it was, before they invented cubicles, there was just kind of like large format, open format office, where just rows of desks, rows of typewriters, and a lot of people working behind them. And huge on the wall is the motto of IBM, which is think. So think, and I remember thinking, whoa, imagine working under that motto all day long, and there's a project in one of my recent books that is more about the kind of tiny little up with people type of reminders, whether it's kind of things that circulate in offices, as the little kitty cat, dangling from a claw that says "hang in there," and how those sort of aphorisms or sort of kind of folksy optimistic quotes, or they're both at the same time trite and cliche, but at the same time there's got to be some kernel of meaning to them too. So all of that kind of stuff plays a role in how I'm thinking about what kind of environment. I realize that when I start talking about things that my mind goes in like 28 different directions, and so I think also that when people come into these spaces, I want them to be sort of thinking about all of the places where they recall these things from, and that it's not one place, but that they're things that maybe are sort of combined in a way they haven't seen them before, but they're all familiar from someplace outside of an art space.
Mm-hmm. And in that recalling, even if it's in an abstract sense, is nostalgia important to you? Is it relevant, or is it the perception almost of nostalgia? I wonder that you draw upon.
I think particularly my interest in shop culture now, also coming much more prevalent in America, now that everything has been sort of whitewashed by Walmart and extreme corporate and that kind of influence. That the sort of, these kind of dinosaur leftover sole proprietorships, where it is actually like the person running the place is actually the person who owns it and is actually invested in it, and the environment may reflect that. That could be a form of nostalgia. It's, probably just more, an interest in not having this sort of like, like this bland, those things have more, that kind of space has more personality to it than for me, if I would, find an image of almost any environment in the 50s and compare it with some versions of that now, I don't think about even like logo design. Everything's getting rounder and more simplified, and that might be progress, but it also seems to be like it is this sort of homogenization of things that I'm not personally interested in. Mm-hmm. And I like that. Like I said, I'm not sure nostalgia is the right word, but if it's saying like, yes, I have a predilection for space that has been sort of individually determined and conquered, rather than just sort of like, I'm very interested for that reason in these sort of like style manuals of places like, larger corporations. I think the famous ones would be like Abercrombie and Fitch or Gap, where they literally try to like eliminate any element of personal preference, and just sort of kind of try to coat the whole thing over with just what they've determined is the most commercially viable sales tactic. And I actually have much more of an interest in something being a little maybe a little like you're not really sure what you're going to get, but probably a little bit more interesting than some of those places. And I get asked a lot as well about analog versus digital aspect of it too. If it's sort of, I'm not, by simply, being able to exist now, I'm not a Luddite or something, I'm not, but I am very averse. But I realize that comes up for me with regard to social media, that I'm very not interested in sort of social networking and things that actually might be interesting for my work, like, I don't know, Facebook or something, where I realize, no, there is something that I feel like is only accessed by direct live exchange, and I want to keep that, and I want to continue to make pieces that encourage that. So I think both the way these environments get set up, they are also meant to encourage a conversation or a dialogue within them, and I think and so what I'm hoping to do is come up with a way to keep instigating those kind of environments. Also, I very rarely re-show them, and I don't record. I document them out of a sense of responsibility, but you will not go into an exhibition and see a videotape of something I did 4 years ago playing or kind of reduced. And because I personally wouldn't be interested in that, so I'm not going to offer it to anyone either. And I really feel like the point is to continue. And scale fluctuates. I mean, this in 2009, two shows that I did, the Armory, Apothecary, which was a relatively small space in a condensed period of time. And the exhibition Do It Yourself Bauhaus, which was an enormous space over 3.5 months. I feel like the impetus is the same, and it's possible to kind of shift the scale with no problem, but reducing it to the point of there not being a live element or an element that people can really physically enter isn't that interesting to me.